All the way back in 2016, we learned that a new Armored Core game was in the works. So back then, I remember thinking, man, I really should go back and play all of the old Armored Core games. I need to understand why people love this series. How many games could there even be? 5? 6? But then I realized the truth. There are 15 unique Armored Core games. And that's not even counting the 3 PSP remakes or the multiple discs that some of these games have, not to mention the arena modes, the branching mission paths, hard mode, new game plus, optional objectives, the lore that makes even my head spin. These are complex, challenging, and extremely intricate games. And while they never really hit mainstream appeal, it was Armored Core and its dedicated fans that kept From Software afloat for many, many years. And then, sadly, it was those same fans who had to watch their favorite franchise take a back seat when Souls became From Software's breadwinner instead. So I wanted to experience these games the same way that the old fans did, not with emulators, but with old hardware and all of the authenticity and all of the frustration that comes with that. So many eBay purchases, and over $2,000 later, I had them. 3 used consoles, 2 retro capture devices, and 18 absurdly expensive old video games. I was ready, so I went back to the first Armored Core, released all the way back in 1997, and I was thrown straight into the deep end. You must battle against the opponent AC and survive. If you survive, you'll be considered a Raven. That's all. Good luck. This is how Armored Core begins, with you in a fight for your life, taking fire as you frantically run around the arena and attempt to puzzle out the controls. There's literally no guide or tips, nothing, just From Software saying, yeah, you'll figure it out. One by one, I stumble through the controls and try to commit them to memory. X to boost, square to shoot, triangle to change weapon, but when it comes to aiming, something feels wrong, because these enemies can fly, right? Which means I need a way to aim up or down at them. And since moving forwards and backwards are already bound here, that means, yeah. So looking up and down is bound to the left and right back triggers. And that sucks. I'm gonna be honest, even after beating all of these Armored Core games, I'm sitting here now, writing this script, and I honestly could not tell you from memory which back trigger moves the camera up or down. If there was ever a time I needed to look up at something, there was like a 50% chance I was gonna look down at the floor instead. But somehow I pushed through, and I do eventually learn how to get good. These games will simply not allow you to progress if you don't. It's classic From Software, even all those years ago. They throw you in the deep end and expect the best from you. Will you sink or swim?
The test is over. From this moment on, you are a Raven.
This is the Raven's Nest. Here you can assemble your mech, but you have no new parts right now. So you go to the shop, where you have no money. So you end up at the mission board, where you become a wage slave to the 2 biggest corporations, Chrome and Murakumo, who are in this desperate battle with each other for supremacy. But your first mission is from the city guard, who are very angry because some workers are protesting in a nearby factory. And since it's not a good look for the city guard to use lethal force on, citizens, innocent civilians, they give you 14,000 credits to do it instead. And so, you get to it. The workers' crude cranes and worker MTs are no match for your armored war machine, and you walk away with 14,000 credits. Except, wait, you have to pay for the bullets you used on those evil protesters, and you'll also need to repair the damage you took during the mission as well. Don't worry, there are always more striking workers who need to be taught a lesson, and there's always someone else's dirty work to profit from. I was making pretty good money. That is, until the 3rd mission, where I was tasked with rescuing a truck filled with chemical weaponry, and I proceeded to promptly blow up the truck, and I assumed that I would just get to try again, but no. Instead, the mission completed and gave me my reward. minus 1.4k for ammunition, minus 4.4k for repairs, and minus 200 credits in compensation for that poor civilian's car that I crushed during the heat of battle. So I hadn't just failed the mission, I had actually lost money attempting it. I knew I was going to be morally bankrupt going into this game, but turns out you can be financially bankrupt as well, if you play poorly enough. Looking back at my footage now, I realize I was way too hesitant to spend credits, probably because new parts and their stats were just so overwhelming to me. Eventually though, I would realize that you can't really go too wrong spending credits in these games. If it's expensive, chances are it's an upgrade, and even if you regret buying it, you can always sell those parts back to the shop for the same price that you bought them at and just buy something else instead. This is a game that will not stop you making mistakes, but it won't always punish you for those mistakes either. So I had no idea what I wanted to buy from the shop, but I had heard whispers about a legendary weapon that existed in this game, and I knew I needed to try it. I needed to figure out why it was so popular. It's called the Kurosawa, an energy rifle that you actually can't get in the shop. Instead, it was one of the many hidden parts in this game. These are parts that you actually have to hunt down and pick up during missions. I had read somewhere that the Kurosawa was hidden behind some explosive barrels in an early mission, and it was easy enough to find.
Weapon obtained.
Okay, so this thing was insane. It dramatically increased my firepower, and most enemies would die in just a few shots. But it wasn't without its downsides. For one, the Kurosawa was extremely heavy, so I realized I needed to buy heavy legs in order to accommodate that weight. The Kurosawa also has pretty limited ammo, so I equipped some light missiles as backup. It's really interesting how just changing one part of your build can fundamentally change your build. New parts will introduce new problems that need to be solved, and by solving these, your knowledge about parts and stats will just naturally increase, and I think that's really cool. I also realized that the Kurosawa was an energy weapon, so it costs energy to fire. That meant I needed to take a closer look at my generator, and I needed to decide whether I needed a generator with high energy regen or a generator with high capacity. High regen would make me better in prolonged fights, but high capacity would allow me to fire a ton more shots and overwhelm enemies in the short term. I'm going to repeat this point so many times over the course of this video, but I think it's really amazing that Armored Core allows you to change such fundamental things about your gameplay. Anyway, the final thing I learned from the Kurosawa was that its energy ammo was actually free, and in the early game, when you're strapped for cash, that's an amazing thing. And so I was learning so many lessons here that would serve me well in all of the Armored Core games to follow. Now, the Kurosawa was powerful, but it's not like it made the game easy. Looking up and down was still a pain, some missions had very unclear objectives, and there were so many missions where I just spent ages navigating mazes of corridors with agonizingly slow turn speeds, only to die or run out of ammo right at the end. So most of the time I was just craving single combat against enemy ACs. Those were my favorite fights, and if the fight had some questionable voice acting to laugh at, well, even better.
You're a raven? I don't know anything about those things here. What did you hear? Forget it. Prepare to die.
There was also a frustrating moment at the end where I died to the final boss, and then I got a unique cutscene. This wasn't just a unique cutscene, it was a game over screen. So, for the first time, in hours of play, I discovered this, and it booted me back to my last save, which I had made so long ago. So it was just so much fun having to redo all these missions again and try to remember what I had changed in my build. That was great. And you might say, well, you should have just saved, but this was the PS1 era, you know? Saving took time. Menus were slow, so I didn't bother to save until I had this experience. But I pushed through. This last level I was stuck on was tricky because it required me to clear rooms and rooms of enemies really efficiently, so I had to make sure to manage my health and ammo so that I had the resources required for the final boss. It was fun, overcoming it, Except this was not the final boss, and I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The true final mission takes place at the Raven's Nest headquarters, where a mysterious band has broken in and left behind a set of floating mines. Now, the Raven's Nest itself wants you to come in and dismantle them. The first part of this mission is simple enough. I had to take out one small room of 5 easy enemies, making sure I used my blade to conserve ammo, because the next room was considerably more difficult, as it was so packed full of enemies that my PlayStation lagged uncontrollably. This room was tricky, but easier with some practice, and I had plenty of opportunities to practice, because while your ammunition and health is restored after completing this second room, if you fail after this point, you'll get game over and have to go all the way back to your last save. So, for part 2 of the mission, you find yourself in this vast square hallway. Lucky for you, there's a way up. Unlucky for you, the devs forgot what game they were making halfway through and decided to start making a platformer instead. But this isn't Doodle Jump, okay? This is Armored Core. Remember, looking up and down in this game is excruciating, and this hallway is vertical, so you have to look up to where you're going, and then you have to look down to make sure you have your landing secured every time, because all of these platforms are moving. They're moving in different directions as well, and all at different speeds. Some will even run into each other and slide you off, which is great. And then there's the turrets that are attached on the top and bottom of many platforms, which will give you knockback and stagger and damage while you attempt your ascent. They don't do much damage, and they don't take that many hits to defeat, but oh man, you're gonna really miss that HP and ammo when you finally get to the top, because the worst is yet to come. This is just a frustrating, time-consuming interlude for you to enjoy every single time you have to redo this mission. And unless you're an Armored Core god or using save states on an emulator, you will have to redo this mission. And that's because of what or who comes next.
Name of AC: 9-ball.
If you had ever looked at the ranking menu in the Raven's Nest, you would have seen a list of all the enemy ACs in the game, and 9-ball is the top-ranked AC, piloted by someone named Hustler1. And he's top rank for a reason. Just watch this attempt of me fighting him. But not to worry, after getting over it 20 minutes later, I was back for round 2. Which went like this. And on and on and on it went, until I simply gave up. 9-ball is overpowered. Literally, he actually has something unlocked called Human Plus, which is an overpowered state that you can unlock if you go into 50,000 credits in debt, which is cool, but I didn't do that. So, 9-ball can fly better than me, he's faster than me, he has better weaponry than me, he approaches from above with the high ground, and he forces you to fight by aiming up and down because of the nature of the vertical arena that you're in. Plus, you've already been weakened mentally and physically by playing Jump King for the last 10 minutes every time you attempt this. So, I decided to not fight at all. I decided to run for my fucking life past this absolute terror to see if I could just get past him and complete the mission that way. On my first escape run, I choked, and I missed the tiny hole that you're supposed to fly into. And then, on my second try, I made it, but somehow 9-ball managed to get in after me. Back then, I guess I had one thought in my mind here, and that was to flee, to run down the corridor in terror, away from this black and red AC that had been killing me all day. The AI core that you destroy at the end is somehow part of 9-ball's consciousness, and you destroy it. Mission complete. Thank God I don't have to fight that guy again. Next up was Armored Core Project Phantasma, which was released only a few months after the first Armored Core. They were able to do this because while Project Phantasma can still be played as its own standalone game, It's perhaps more accurate to call this an expansion. The game essentially plays the same as the first one, except with new missions, new parts, and some rebalancing to old parts. You can even transfer your save from the first game over to this one if you want to continue with your previous AC build and all of its parts, which is really cool. And this is basically how all of the Armored Core games work. The easiest way to understand how they're all connected is when they're arranged like this. Each row represents a generation of Armored Core games where your save can continue within the generation. There's Gen 1 for the PS1, Gen 2, 3 and 3.5 for the PS2, then Gen 4 and 5 for the PS3 and Xbox 360. Generations 1 to 3.5 play quite similarly, but the series would eventually change radically in Generation 4, and then again in Generation 5, as you'll see later on. Anyway, I wanted to try a new build in Project Phantasma, and I'd since learned that the most defining part of your build are your legs. It's kind of like the RPG equivalent of choosing a class. They determine how fast you move, how fast you turn, the nature of your movement, but perhaps most importantly, how much weight you can carry. First, I tried some tread legs. Tread legs allow you to carry extremely heavy loads and even allow you to fire heavy back weapons while you're moving or flying, which no other leg part can do. However, this comes at the cost of your movement and flying ability, and one mission was enough for me to decide that this was not for me. Like, imagine completing every mission in the game going this slowly. What I ended up settling on were quad legs. Quad legs are kind of like tread legs in the sense that they allow you to fire heavy back weapons while you're moving, though you can't fly while you do so. But unlike tread legs, quad legs exist on a bit of a spectrum where you can equip heavy load-bearing quads, but also fast, lightweight quads as well. I opted for the latter. Now, lightweight ACs are kind of hard to put together because there's a lower weight limit which prevents you from choosing stronger, weightier parts. So putting this build together would require a lot of trial and error. But I realized that there was no better place for this build process than in a place called the Arena. In the Arena, you fight exclusively against enemy ACs in one-on-one combat, ranking up and earning credits as you go. And while enemy ACs are some of the toughest enemies that you can face in these games, there are no ammo costs here, and you can only really benefit from these fights. But best of all, it teaches you about different enemy builds, and it shows you what works, what doesn't work, and it shows you the limits of your own build. It's the perfect space to refine and adjust your AC into a machine that's capable of taking on some of the hardest fights in the game, and that's what my build quickly became, a fast, lightweight quad with machine gun arms and ammo canisters on its back. A build designed to do one thing really well, and that was to run circles around my opponents, staying outside of their FCS lockbox and keeping them in my own. It's hard to explain just how satisfying it is to refine your build in these games and to see it all come together perfectly at the end. You know, you solve energy problems, weight problems, ammo problems, you compromise on some parts, but then you stand your ground on others, and if you're lucky, you'll end up with a build that is entirely your own. You know how to play it. You know what its weaknesses are, you know its strengths, you know exactly what challenges went into creating it, and it's yours. So when I went back into missions and I realized that machine gun ammo costs were going to put me deep into debt, it was easy for me to tweak my build into a more cost-efficient one for most missions because I understood how to undo certain parts of my build. But for the final mission, I wheeled out my lightweight, expensive AC killer and went to town. The final fight was against Stinger, who's a bit of a joke, honestly, at least compared to 9-Ball in the previous game. Stinger's strategy was to shoot out so many rainbow bullets that my FPS would drop to unplayable levels, and it almost worked. because I actually ran out of ammo in this fight and assumed that I'd lost. So at this point I actually gave up and went close to him so that he could just kill me faster and get it over with, but then this happened. His own missiles dealt the final piece of damage to himself. Pretty fitting way for this guy to go out. My AC gloriously flies into the roof, and that's the end of Project Phantasma. I felt like I was getting pretty good at the series, but From Software were watching, just waiting to tear me back down again, because the next game was Armored Core Master of Arena, and I legitimately felt dread when I put in the disc, loaded up that first mission, and watched this cutscene.
Don't shoot me! I'm leaving now! What? Another one? Nineball? What's a top-ranked arena AC doing here?
I heard you've been looking for me. I don't care who you are. No one can defeat me.
Nineball was back, and this time it was personal, on a few levels, because I wanted revenge on Nineball for him shaming me in the first game, in front of all my YouTube viewers as well. But apparently, my character in the game wanted revenge as well.
He's the one you've been looking for, huh?
Lana is your contact at the Raven's Nest, and mail from her reads, "When we first met on the network, you mentioned becoming a Raven because there was someone you wanted to kill. AC name Nineball, Pilot Hustler 1, top-ranked AC in the arena. That is all we know." She comments that anyone who attempts to face Nineball in battle will surely be destroyed, that if we're really serious about this, then she can arrange it so that we will one day fight him. So Lana immediately passes us a mission from ProgTech, who manufacture AC parts. They want us to put down some rampaging robots in their factory, and in return, they'll give us some free parts and sponsor us in the arena. What follows is this glorious mix of mission and arena gameplay. Sometimes your mission board will be completely empty and all you can access is the arena, which you'll need to progress in order to unlock missions again. And then sometimes it's the reverse, where the arena is locked off because there's an urgent mission you need to complete for your sponsor. And it's this balance, the way that the arena and mission gameplay is interwoven, that makes Master of Arena easily rank within my top 3 Armored Core games, because the pacing is just phenomenal. In other games, sometimes missions would feel like a grind, and sometimes doing the arena would just feel like an optional side quest, but in this game, missions had me feel like I was strengthening my relationship with my sponsor, and when I progressed in the arena, I knew it was in pursuit of a goal, to rise through the ranks so that I could one day have the right to challenge Nineball, who is formidable in the story of this game just as he's formidable in a gameplay sense as well. So I continued to chip away at the missions, and in the arena I was a demon. I was this red AC wielding the Kurosawa and a moonlight sword and some really fast legs. These legs were so fast that I didn't really need my boosters, which meant that I had more energy for shooting my Kurosawa while grounded. With this build, I flew through the arena, and if I was ever having trouble with an opponent, it would be because they were flying, but if they were flying, I would just take them to the garage, which was an arena level that limited their flight capabilities and kept them on the ground with me, so I didn't have to touch the accursed R2 and L2 triggers. I was feeling pretty confident, and then the final fight with Nineball arrived. I thought this fight went pretty well. Got him on the first try. Except that wasn't the end.
The corporation, the ACs, the Raven's Nest. All of these were formed by me. For the sole purpose of recreating the world and humankind with it. And that's the duty to which I've been entrusted. Those who wield too much power. Those who only bring chaos. They are simply not part of the program.
Phase 2 has you fighting 2 9 balls, and that's exactly as hard as it sounds. The reason there's 2 is because it's been revealed that the 9 balls are able to be mass-produced, and they actually aren't piloted by a human. Instead, they're controlled by a highly advanced combat AI that thinks it can rebuild the world by manufacturing conflict, as long as they're the strongest Raven, which is why it has to take you out, which it does, repeatedly.
Why do you insist on interfering?
Quickly, I realized that it's extremely important that you do well in the first fight against the single 9 ball, because your health and ammo that remains is what you'll need to take on the other 2 at once. And after a ton of time-consuming resets, I realized that there was an upper level to the dual 9 ball fight, which could be used to potentially separate the 2 and help you to fight one at a time. Finally, I was victorious.
I was created to protect mankind and this world. I intend to fulfill this task.
There's this kind of like absurd, giddy dread that I've only ever really experienced playing FromSoft games. That feeling that even though you've pushed yourself to the limit, the challenge actually isn't over yet.
Modifying program, final level. All system checks are complete. Combat mode is now engaged. Target verified. Commencing hostilities.
Defenses damaged. Halting combat and returning to the nest.
This third phase is extremely tough, and it also takes a while to learn it because you have to defeat 1 9 ball and then you have to defeat the 2 9 balls before you even get a chance to practice this fight. And those 2 fights were hard enough, so you don't get that many chances to practice. But eventually I learned that 9 ball Seraph, as he's called, always begins the fight by running at you with his blade, which sends energy waves and requires a well-timed boost jump for you to evade it. After that, he'll transform into this little rocket ship and zoom around the arena, shooting missiles and trying to get behind you, before transforming back into an attack phase and just closing the distance with his blade and his pulse rifle once again. Over and over I tried to defeat him, and over again I lost. But I had heard rumors of something, a controller technique that I thought might just be able to help me. It's something called the legendary armored core grip. Some said that it was a meme. Others said that by holding your controller backwards, you could get full access to every button at once, which would allow for perfect control of your AC. So I gave it a try. Finally, after countless attempts at Phase 1 and about 16 victories in Phase 2, I managed to overcome Phase 3 with a little bit of skill and a lot of luck. And I was just joking about using the armored core grip. Or was I? Anyway, 9 ball was dead. Thank God I don't have to fight that guy again. Next up, Armored Core 2. I was excited for this because this was a PS2 game and I had been eyeing that PS2 controller off to my side for a while now, just knowing it had what I wanted, dual analog sticks. I couldn't wait to be able to aim properly, so I grabbed the controller, moved the sticks, and they didn't work. What? For some unfathomable reason, From Software had decided to stick with the back triggers for camera control in this game, which I just don't understand. The solution was right there. It's insane to me that this wasn't a design priority for them. Maybe there's a good reason for this, but I don't know. Anyway, let's talk story. So, Armored Core 2 takes place 67 years after the events of Master of Arena, when a cataclysmic event called the Great Destruction forced mankind underground. Eventually, however, mankind discovered the pre-war Mars Immigration Project and started to set up colonies on the Red Planet, where wars over resources would inevitably break out once more. It's a compelling story, but I wanted my story to begin in a really unique way this time. So this time I didn't start with a single mission. Instead, I committed for some reason to playing exclusively in the arena until I had defeated every single opponent and become the top-ranked Raven. This ended up being an extremely memorable experience for me, and while the arena doesn't incur repair and ammo costs, it doesn't exactly give you many credits at the start either, so there was a limit to which parts I could afford when attempting to outsmart my enemies. So for me, it was very important to read these character descriptions before each fight, and I loved how much story and insight each one revealed. Some characters were in the arena to pay off gambling debts, some were here to show off their new parts they had for sale, or I distinctly remember number 45, who was a girl piloting a mech in order to earn money to feed her starving family. Feels bad. But most importantly, some descriptions revealed the enemy AI's preferred strategies and weaknesses. For example, this guy was famously bad at energy management, and then there was another one who would panic if you pressured them, and then some enemies were just pure comedy. At one point, I met Bullet Dragon, a man who was in the arena because he loved the sound of machine guns, and he only fought so that he could afford more ammo. I couldn't outpace him with my own machine gun, so I outlasted him, and he flat out, I don't know if this was a glitch or anything, but he just seemed to decide to leave the arena when he started to run out of machine gun ammo. And then there was Supersonic, who was a character who spent all his money on the fastest parts. Like, he was just here to build for speed and nothing else. And then, poor guy, he actually went so fast that he flew out of bounds in the arena, and I won. 10 out of 10. It's in Armored Core 2's arena that I experimented with basically every weapon type in the shop. There were so many ways to express your creativity in the builds in this game, and constantly trying to exploit new enemy weaknesses taught me so much about the pros and cons of various weaponry. But the best lesson I think I learned was from number 19, AC name Mass, pilot name Bulk. Guess what his build is? Yeah, so his build was designed to just stay alive while his opponents ran out of ammo, which I did many times. And in trying to overcome him, I found it. My new best friend, the EWG MG SAW. A machine gun with 1,000 rounds of ammo, which allowed me to focus on one strategy, unrelenting offense. And with this gun, I went all the way towards top rank, but on the way, I met Count 1, pilot name, number 1111, rank 11. He's obsessed with the number 1, and has put a great deal of effort into his current position. He'd rather be ranked 11th than first, as it has twice as many 1s. I realized even his weapon arms looked like 2 sets of 1s, so you gotta respect the commitment. But in retrospect, his weapon arms would end up being the key, because my machine gun circling strategy ended up being useless against the top-ranked AC Ares, who had the firepower and the turning ability to completely counter my strategy, so I built for power to overwhelm him instead. And that's where I got the idea from number 11, who used weapon arms. And with these bazooka arms, I absolutely destroyed Ares to become number 1. 1-1 was enough for me. Now I could actually start playing the game, and when I finally did start the missions, it didn't matter that my machine gun ammo was extremely expensive. I was an arena millionaire, and when I finally got to the last mission and there was this sequence where I needed to fight enemies that I couldn't lock onto, the arena had already taught me what to do. Instead of brute forcing the final fight with sheer stubbornness like I had in previous games, I actually used my shop knowledge to come up with a better build and a better strategy, and equipped with rockets and grenade cannons that didn't really need lock-on to function properly, I made the final sequence way easier for myself. The final boss's name is Leos Klein, and interestingly it's implied that he was actually the player character from Master of Arena, and I love these little callbacks. There's a depth to the storytelling that I was discovering, although I'll admit 99% of the storytelling was going over my head as I was just so focused on the gameplay. But even though I'm not paying much attention to the story in these playthroughs yet, anyway, even I can tell when it's missing, and nowhere did story feel more absent than in Armored Core 2, Another Age. The big selling point in this expansion seems to be the sheer amount of missions. I felt like most of these games had an average of between 20 or 30 missions before you hit an ending, but in Another Age, there are 100 missions in the game, and whereas in some other games you can skip certain missions or just have them go away if you fail, all 100 missions in Another Age are mandatory. Now, I'm gonna be honest, every Armored Core game does have its fair share of very badly designed missions. Missions where you get lost in endless corridors with unclear objectives, or missions where you go out of bounds, or are forced to do platforming for some reason, and Another Age did have tons of missions that I hated, but the worst in my opinion were missions that your AC could be fundamentally incompatible with. For example, there was a mission here that required me to ascend a long corridor, and I just couldn't with so many of my builds. And don't get me wrong, I love reworking my AC to solve combat puzzles, but having my build be fundamentally incompatible with some mandatory missions was frustrating, to say the least. I guess this is why Armored Core 6 might be adding jump pads, huh? But then there is a bright side to having mandatory missions in that it does at least force you to try different things, but more importantly it forces you to get good. For example, perhaps the most memorable mission for me in Another Age was this one, where you have to fight not 1, not 2, but 3 enemy ravens all at the same time. And that is, again, exactly as hard as it sounds. One of the enemies was a heavy tank build that can harass you if you leave it alive. Another is extremely mobile and is equipped with powerful weaponry that will take you down very, very quickly. And the third AC luckily isn't much of a threat at all, but they still do serve as a distraction and require precious time and ammo to take down. So once you have stock of your opponents, you have to come up with a strategy and make sure your AC design accommodates that strategy. And then you have to make sure you have the skill to actually put that strategy into action. After a few attempts, I realized that I had the best success when I took out the tank AC with machine gun fire, since they came at me first and they weren't fast enough to dodge any of my projectiles. But fighting the other two was the real challenge, because together they were difficult to split apart and they would just grind me down over time. So I needed a secondary weapon that could take one of them out quickly with overwhelming power. I chose missiles as my secondary weapon, and I also equipped a relation missile extension part. So once this extension was activated, it basically shot out more missiles as a bonus whenever I shot out my normal missiles, which basically doubled my damage output for a short amount of time, which was enough time to deal a severe amount of damage and finally even the odds. But then there was still a final piece of this puzzle, which was taking out the third AC, and this was just an ammo issue. I had a few attempts where I absolutely destroyed the first two, but simply did not have enough ammo to finish the job. It was frustrating, but eventually I made a build with 2 sets of very ammo-efficient missiles, and I grit my teeth, and I took out the final AC on a sliver of health, 1 missile at a time.
This can't be!
I genuinely felt like I achieved something here. It was really rewarding to have to discover the pieces of the puzzle on the battlefield and then solve that puzzle in the garage and then put that solution to the test. In my opinion, this is Armored Core at its best. And by the way, there is a part of Armored Core 6's trailer that shows the player fighting against 3 enemy ACs at once, so yeah, you should probably prepare yourself for that. But then it was back to the mission grind. And credit where credit is due, the way you navigate all of the missions in this game is very cool, because there are multiple missions for each region, and there's a good sense of familiarity and progression in the world as a result of that. And finally, I made it to the end.
It was a pleasure working with you, Raven. But I'm afraid this time it's personal.
I'll be honest, I don't even know who that guy is. More than in any other Armored Core game, I actually kind of felt like an independent Raven in this one, just grinding away at mission after mission on behalf of faceless corporations for credits alone. So, after spending so much time on this game, I was actually kind of appreciative when I got this message from FromSoftware at the end. Thanks, Raven. You've accomplished a great feat. Your achievement is recognized by us. And then they give you a well-deserved reward. More missions. Great. But to be fair, these missions were kind of the best of all. You face off against who I can only assume is Stinger from Project Phantasma, with his being all glitchy and corrupted. I kind of like the flavor of these ancient ACs just persisting throughout the ages to eventually be fought as these corrupted remnants of another age later on. And of course, the real final fight is against 9-Ball Seraph again, because of course it is.
Target verified. Commencing hostilities.
And here he fights the exact same way he does in Master of Arena, though the controls and visuals are thankfully a lot better in this game. As then, he's extremely tough, but here I discover a strategy that will serve me well in future games. If you're ever facing an AC that tries to get behind you, just back up against a wall. If fought in this manner, 9-Ball will chase you around the edge of the arena instead of just dashing behind you all the time, and he follows you around, he slashes at you with energy waves and shoots his projectiles, but you can just dodge them with another strategy I learned, which is to bunny hop boost tightly to the left and right. But even with all this, this fight was still hard as hell, and at this point I'm honestly just kind of amazed at how much FromSoftware likes toying with people's 9-Ball PTSD by putting him in so many games. But I eventually won, and surely I won't have to fight that guy again. And that's the second generation of Armored Core games complete. In retrospect, I think this might be the hardest generation of Armored Core if you take all of the missions together. Anyway, next is Armored Core 3, a whole new generation, and wouldn't it be great if they finally added dual analog controls? Yeah, nah, they still haven't made the right analog stick useful, which is interesting, but at least there's a pretty good story this time. Armored Core 3 takes place during the period of history where mankind was forced underground because of the Great Destruction. Here, subterranean life is governed by the Controller, an AI which quite predictably goes wild. The sequel, Silent Line, deals with the aftermath of you destroying the Controller. Mankind returns to the surface, and corporations begin to fight over what lies beyond the Silent Line. But mysterious technologies are already up here on the surface, and they repel your intrusions. These are very compelling stories. The third generation of games is quite compelling in general, actually. Controls and movement get tighter with every gen, and the way the shop and the garage is integrated is really nice. Menus are faster to navigate, and I could be wrong, but I felt like weight limits were way more generous in this generation, as I had less trouble fitting everything I wanted onto my AC. That said, I'm not sure that there's too much else I have to say about Armored Core 3 or its sequel, Silent Line, that I kinda haven't said already. As usual, there were good missions and frustrating missions, and the final fights were great fun, but I was never really truly challenged by anything in these games, which means I can't really point to any one thing that made these games particularly memorable for me. Overall though, I think Armored Core 3 and Silent Line are an excellent starting point for beginners who want to experience the older generation, precisely because I don't think they're too difficult, and because From Software has just added a ton of quality of life changes to the series by this point. I will say a cool new addition in this generation were left arm parts that weren't just blades or shields. So in this game you can equip your left arm with bazookas and rifles and tons of really fun weaponry. These weapons fire with a delay, but being able to fire 2 weapons at once can dramatically increase your damage output, and it gives a really fun depth to builds. Only problem is, firing 2 weapons means you have to mash 2 face buttons at once to fire them, and remember you're still boosting with the other face button, so that's 3 face buttons you have to press at once, and that's just a huge stress to your finger inputs on top of everything else. So because the series still refused to accommodate the right analog stick for aiming, dual firing was still uncomfortable, with default controls at least, and so I just opted for a passive shield on my left arm instead. But finally, the control scheme would be brought into the modern PS2 era, with Generation 3.5 of Armored Core, which consisted of 3 games: Nexus, Ninebreaker, and, best of all, Last Raven. With the ability to aim with the right stick added in Nexus, the L2 and R2 bumpers were finally released from their torment as camera operators, and were able to be used for intuitive things instead, like boosting and switching weapons, which meant that L1 and R1, instead of strafing, could be used for firing left and right arm weaponry respectively, which meant that dual wielding wasn't just viable, it was incredible. Dual firing added a new offensive depth to the customization that I was so ready for. So I dived into the first mission, equipped with a brand new generator and some really fast boosters, and immediately began to overheat. So temperature management had always been a thing in previous games, but back then I only really ever overheated when I was hit by too much enemy weaponry all at once, and it only did a damage over time effect if I got too hot. In Armored Core Nexus, that all went out the window. Now I noticed my boosters contributing a lot to my heat meter, and if I overheated in this game, then my radiator would activate and suck up immense amounts of my own energy in order to cool down my AC. And that is a lot more impactful than just taking damage over time. So all of a sudden, heat management had become a huge new consideration when considering weaponry, generators, boosters, and radiators. It's almost as if From Software realized that their game had just become easier with the new dual stick controls and thought, we can't have that, and so they added this insane overheat mechanic in Revenge. Regardless, eventually I had my head around this new heat system, so I started to experiment with new dual-wielding setups. I tried double chain guns, double sniper rifles, handguns, laser rifles. It was fun, but what I really fell in love with was dual-wielding 2 different weapons, rather than wielding 2 of the same. I ended up settling on a bazooka and rifle combo. These 2 had similar range, which I think is a really important thing to think about when you're dual-wielding 2 different weapons, but the rifle was great for smaller, faster, or flying enemies, and the bazooka was great for the larger, slower, or grounded enemies. And it was also just a really fun gameplay element to sort of practice firing 2 different weapons at once. That said, I ended Nexus with double bazookas in a fight against a very familiar piece of ancient technology. But at this point, they'd wheeled poor old Nineball out so many times that he's just not the same anymore. Rest in peace, old friend. I guess it does make some sense that Nineball would be here in this game though, as far as I can tell, the story of Nexus is about corporations fighting to control ancient technologies that they don't really understand, and it all backfires in the end. Swarms of unmanned suicide drones spew out of a factory and out onto the Earth, where they blanket the world in another sort of great destruction. It's awful, but it's one of the most memorable endings that these games have ever had, in my opinion, just because of the phenomenal way that it's presented. You stand on the rooftop in the pouring rain, actually able to control your character and fight back as this indomitable barrage of suicide drones ram into you and the Earth's surface, and you make your doomed last stand here. There's no hope of you taking them all out, so you simply fight on as the screen fades to black and Nexus comes to an end. So, I enjoyed Nexus, but I cannot say the same for the next expansion, which is Armored Core 9breaker. So get this game has no missions, it doesn't even have a shop. At its core is a training mode, which is filled with 150 training exercises that test you on things like movement, evasion, accuracy, stuff like that. Fun. That's not really Armored Core to me, so I didn't really bother. When I played, I figured the real point of this game was the uniquely designed arena mode, which requires you to earn points and climb the ranks that way, rather than just beating the next AC in your path. But I made a terrible mistake with this game. I imported my save from Nexus, and I didn't realize this, but it actually removed all of the default parts that I would have had in my garage and just replaced them with what I had in Nexus instead. And I didn't have much unlocked in Nexus, so I was essentially forced to do the entire arena with one build, a heavy biped with 2 bazookas. Luckily, my build was just strong enough to take out 90% of my opponents, but there were some that were borderline impossible with my build, and to get to top rank by defeating the last guy, I had to wait until he challenged me on a map where I could stand at the arena's edge just so he couldn't fly behind me, and I just took him out after countless attempts. Maybe I'll do the training missions to prepare for Armored Core 6, and maybe they'd be great if you're a beginner to the series, but I wanted to move on because I was so excited for the next game. I had heard a lot about it. It's the last Armored Core game that has this old-gen style, and I'd heard that it was perhaps the hardest game that From Software had ever created. Next was Armored Core Last Raven, and it did not disappoint. When we left off in Nexus, unmanned suicide weapons had ravaged the world. The corporations had lost everything, but instead of trying to rebuild individually, they joined forces to form a new corporation called Alliance, but a rebel group known as Vertex vowed to overthrow them, and war quickly escalated into chaos. Now, Vertex has issued a declaration. Their final attack will launch in 24 hours. So it is that Last Raven starts with a clear story and a foreboding timer that counts down after every mission, building the tension. Last Raven also perfects the mission structure, in my opinion, offering a set of missions that, if done in the right order, push you towards different missions and different endings. I really liked being able to take a more active role in the story based on which path I chose in this game. So many of my memories with Armored Core so far had been born from my challenges in these games, so in this playthrough I opted to go down a story path that I had heard was the hardest of them all. It's called the Zenaida path, named after your rival who challenges you in a ton of these missions. So I knew it would get hard. I was prepared for that, but what I wasn't prepared for was for the first mission to literally be harder than anything I'd faced in the previous 2 games. Like, to put this into context, I had just imported my build from 9breaker, and this AC design, with its dual bazookas, this had taken me through the entirety of that game. It had taken me through the entirety of Nexus as well. And yet, I was struggling with the first mission in Last Raven with this build. So eventually I took a step back and I realized I needed to perfect my AC further if I was going to take on these missions. So I took a few steps back actually, and I went all the way back to the first disc of Nexus where I farmed credits for a few hours just so I could buy every part in the shop. Then I went into the second disc of Nexus, which had some optional parts that I had missed, and in these missions I found an insanely powerful Ananda radiator to stop me from overheating, and I also found something called a linear rifle, which was kind of like a halfway point between a bazooka and a rifle. It had good stun capabilities, and it helped my offhand weapon hit more reliably, and it would be at my side for the entirety of Last Raven, actually. I also discovered a type of missile called micro-missiles, which send a barrage of smaller missiles out, which makes them great for overwhelming enemies with anti-missile systems built into their core or built into their extensions. And with this setup, I was eventually able to kite the enemy AC, named Bolt, around the arena, staying just out of range of his cannons and unloading everything I had. Every circuit around the battlefield, I would take some time to hide and recover energy behind these buildings, and then I would start the circuit again. It was close, but I had completed the first mission. Or at least, I thought I had. I didn't know what was going on. I thought I had broken some crucial part of my AC here, and I thought the audio was glitching out as a result, because Last Raven did add a new feature where you can break certain body parts on your build during battle. So for a minute there, I thought this experience was very immersive. I was like, wow, the head part's broken and my audio's glitched. That's amazing. But my disc was actually scratched. So that'll teach me to buy things off eBay, I guess. My mission flat out refused to end, so I reset my PS2, managed to beat the mission again, and the same glitch did happen, but at least it let me finish the mission this time. Surely this won't be an issue later, right? As was tradition, whenever I knew I needed to get stronger, I took on the arena, and to my surprise, I flew through almost all of it with no issue. I even added some heavy bipedal legs that I chose for their excellent boost speed, despite how heavy they were, which helped to offset the issues that I had with my slow movement since I was just bunny hopping most of the time anyway. So I would activate my EO core and get these little floating turrets, and then I'd unload all my micro missiles and my relation missiles, and then I'd purge all my missiles and drop them to lighten my load and increase my speed before transitioning to linear rifle and bazooka and kiting my enemy around for the win. Few stood a chance against this build, and so my enemies weren't really that memorable as a result, although one of the funniest builds I faced in this arena was some guy with the hover extension part who had built an infinite flight build. His build was pretty useless and very easy to shoot at in the sky, but it was interesting, and I didn't know that that was possible. But then everything became incredibly difficult when I met the guy at the top of the arena, Dain. And I think this guy might take the title for being the best pilot I had faced in these games. Just look at his technique. He's a god. By combining a close-range machine gun with some sort of bazooka, Dain is essentially able to stun-lock you to death in no time at all, and because he's so adept at flying at close range, it's an absolute nightmare trying to keep him in your sights, even with these new analog controls. I died to him over and over and over, and I felt true despair. Because this wasn't like previous games, I couldn't choose the arena in Last Raven. I couldn't just put him in the garage and call it a day. No, this arena was perfectly suited to his aerial strengths. I tried a few new things against Dain. I tried equipping an overboost core to help me get some distance, but then my energy would run out and he would close in. I even tried a vertical FCS part for the first time, which gave me this tall lockbox that was a bit better suited to Damon's movement trajectory, but nope, not enough. I was about to give up and come back later, but then I had an idea. I thought back to that hover AC that I had laughed at just a few hours ago and wondered, what if that was the key? What if I built something like that? if I could get up onto the roof and stay there, then I'd be able to completely negate Damon's aerial supremacy. I thought there was at least a chance this would work, so I went into the garage with all my parts and got to work. Luckily, Last Raven includes the ability for you to tune most parts to be better in line with your specific build requirements. But even so, this infinite flight build turned out to be extremely tricky to make, but it taught me a lot. First, I needed the build to be able to get me high into the air, so I chose reverse bipedal legs for their superior jumping. Then I needed a generator with enough capacity, and boosters that had enough power to get me to the roof. Then I needed my build to be energy efficient enough to keep my hover extension active so that I could stay hovering. This meant that I needed to choose parts that had low energy drain, as every part takes away from your generator's maximum output. Eventually, I had a build that was so energy efficient it could float in the air and recover energy slowly as well. But then the final problem was to cram weaponry onto this thing. Without it weighing or draining me down, I needed weapons that were light, ammo efficient, and with a lot of range. I eventually settled on micro missiles and a sniper rifle, and then, after so much trial and failure, I had it. I called this AC Vulture, after the way it sort of circles around its foes out of range, and it eventually took me to victory against Damon with literally 0 ammo to spare. I guess you could argue I cheesed this fight, but it didn't feel like it, because Armored Core's gameplay begins in the garage, and I felt super proud of this win, because it felt like I had solved a really complex puzzle. But for now, I put Vulture away, and I pulled out my Blast Raven build instead, and I got back to the missions. By the way, that's another cool thing about Last Raven. You're able to save and load different builds quickly. It's as if you have different mechs just sitting in your hangar, waiting to be taken out when it's their time to shine. Being able to load specific builds is an amazing feature for these games to have, as it stops you having to tinker with your build in the menus for ages. Instead, you can build solutions, name them, get attached to them, and then be ready to switch up your gameplay style whenever those builds are perfect for the situation at hand. Armored Core 6 had better have a system like this, I swear. Even Elden Ring should have a system like this. Another thing Armored Core 6 should take from Last Raven is its in-game lore repository, which is just a great way for players to recap the story in-game. You know, this way they don't have to rely on over-dramatic YouTubers for all their lore. Maybe don't put that in the game. Last Raven's missions were a delight. Actually, the best I'd experienced so far. Almost everyone was peppered with familiar enemy ACs that would show up or betray you, and missions were just these great tests of your combat efficiency, rather than having you run around the map for obscure objectives. That said, there was one bad mission which plunged me into pure blackness after a maze of corridors, which made it borderline impossible to escape this place without having a headpiece that had night vision on it, which I didn't have, so that was pretty lame. But throughout all of these missions, I'd actually been putting up with something even more painful. Remember that glitch that showed up on my first mission, where audio would bug out and the mission wouldn't end? Well, that had been happening this whole time, and a lot of missions I had to repeat, and eventually it became so bad that I found one mission that just wouldn't end. Again and again and again I completed this mission and it refused to move on, until I gave up. I couldn't progress. I had to suck it up and put away the PS2 and use an emulator to finish Last Raven instead. Okay, so you might be noticing a difference in the quality of the visuals. Looking back, I really regret not trying emulators sooner. This was kind of amazing. With the right settings, Last Raven runs at a higher frame rate, plays at a sharper resolution, and I was even able to use save states to help me get back to where I was in the missions faster. It hurt having to do all these missions again, but I was enjoying the gameplay even more than before. Listen, I love old hardware, and if I had just used emulators, then I might have been tempted to use save states to overcome crucial moments of difficulty and tedium. And if I had run these games at a silky smooth 60 FPS and high resolutions, the games would have been a lot easier and looked a lot better than they really are. I wouldn't have experienced them the same way everyone else did all those years ago. But all that said, I'd still recommend emulating these games over buying scratched, overpriced discs on eBay. eBay has atrocious buyer support and they won't let me get a refund for this scratch disc, so yeah, don't do that. Anyway, eventually I made it to the final mission. A final gauntlet that requires you to dodge through these long hallways filled with suicide drones. And then eventually I actually got a checkpoint for the first time in Armored Core, so I didn't have to reset from the start anymore, but I just had to take out some lasers on the walls, and then it was the final fight with Zenaida. Here, she is widely regarded to be the most difficult fight in this game, and I'll let you watch and figure out why.
You have to fight her, Raven.
She fights a lot like Damon, except I think she's even faster than him, but she does fight at more of a mid-range, and she has these energy weapons that overheat you and somehow don't slow her down at all. Like the best enemy ACs, I'm pretty sure she's just cheating, because there's no way you can build an AC that could match her movement and firepower, right? Not to mention you have to start this fight at low health because of the suicide drones, unless you make it past the drones without taking damage, which is what I did. I spent ages learning the drone patterns and then managed to somehow get to the checkpoint with full health. Then I just had to solve the Zenaida fight somehow. I knew I couldn't outrun her with my heavy AC, so I came up with a new strategy. I realized that if I moved forwards and backwards like this, then she would fly into my sights for a brief moment, just long enough for me to get off a salvo of missiles. And then for the first time I was actually dealing consistent damage to her. But would it be enough? It required precise inputs, perfect aim, and by the end I was gripping my controller so hard that my hands hurt. But then, at 500 AP, I got it. The final shot. The sun sets on you as the last Raven. Finally, I'd completed every game in these old generations. Next was the 4th generation, and it was here that the series would change forever, for a new game director had entered the scene. That's right, Armored Core 4 and Armored Core 4 Answer are directed by none other than Hidetaka Miyazaki himself, and in his new, very different 4th generation of Armored Core, Raven pilots are no more. They've been superseded by Lynx, who pilot Nexts, new and improved Armored Cores that can move and fly and fight on a whole other level. I mean, just look at how fast they are. The reason this combat is so much more intense is because A, it's now much easier to attain infinite flight and keep your boosters on at all times, and B, side boosts now have a dedicated button, rather than being a niche extension part that only moved you in one direction. What's more, cancelling your boosters and tapping side boost can allow you to perform a quick turn maneuver, giving skilled players the means to keep enemies in their sights during this frantic combat. Having these boosts built into the default controls was, in my opinion, a huge step forward for the franchise, and of all the games, these are the ones that I've replayed the most, having 6 full playthroughs under my belt to date. And while Armored Core 4 is great, and I really enjoyed putting together this energy weapon build that dual wields pulse guns, only to throw them away when they're out of ammo and reveal a backup set of 2 more pulse guns, that was fun. Most of my playthroughs are actually in 4's sequel, which is Armored Core 4 Answer, because I feel like it's here, in this game, that the true potential of this generation was fully realized. Not just in gameplay, but in storytelling and tone as well. So for the first time, I want to start by talking about the music in this game. To be fair, the music in Armored Core has always been great. You've been hearing it all throughout this video, after all, and a lot of the credit for that seems to have to go to a man named Kota Hoshino, who composed on almost all of these soundtracks. He even runs a band called Frequency, whose music releases overlap almost entirely with the Armored Core franchise and its distinct sound, and that's so cool. It's cool that Armored Core has its own in-house band that plays for it. It also seems like Kota Hoshino has been working with From Software ever since, so I really hope that his band creates some music for Armored Core 6, because the music was always good, but something specifically changed with Generation 4's music, especially with Phantasma, where many songs play with this melancholy, nostalgic, almost haunting sound to them, and it added such a good vibe to the franchise. I mean, just listen to this. These sort of reflective songs play in a lot of key missions, and I feel like they're trying to get you to ask the question, why? Why are we fighting? Are we really doomed to have all of this destruction play out over and over and over again? And the answer is inevitably yes. Despite their promise, humanity is doomed. And in fact, Armored Core Phantasma actually has one of the darkest, most disturbing endings that From Software has ever directed. And I want to show it to you. Thing is, you can only get this unique ending if you complete the game 3 times, so that's why I decided to replay Phantasma so many times, and I'm so glad I did, because these New Game Plus missions are some of the best in the franchise, and replaying the game so many times helped me to play closer to that insanely high skill ceiling that the 4th generation lays claim to. S-ranking certain missions rewarded me with new parts, and replaying so many times also gave me a ton of FRS points to invest, which are basically these stat points that allow you to level up and further tune the performance of your AC. By the end, I was overboosting, side boosting, and just fighting with a speed and precision that I'm honestly quite proud of, looking back. The reason my overboost looks so cool here is because I'm using a core from the legendary White Glint, which gives it a unique animation. White Glint is Phantasma's cover character, and they're a legendary character in this generation. So, because I was taking parts from this mech, I jokingly called my next Black Flint, and actually ended up becoming pretty attached to this build over the course of 3 playthroughs. Black Flint is equipped with dual machine gun arms, which fire both chambers with R1, and despite these weapons being extremely powerful on their own, you're still allowed to fire a back weapon at the same time, so I ended up equipping the Yamaga, a grenade launcher that fires from the back here. And it's really fun firing the machine guns constantly while always looking out for the perfect moment to fire a grenade. If my aim was good enough, I could destroy enemies so quickly that their dialogue couldn't even finish in time. Not to mention, the other parts I chose allowed not only for infinite flight, but basically infinite side boosting as well, making me extremely difficult to hit. And then there's my shoulder attachments, where I opted for the Euphoria, which increase my primal armor. But what is primal armor? Well, this is your primal armor. It's a regenerating resource that primarily reduces the damage you take, but it's also a resource that you can dip into for overboosting like this, or using assault armor like this. And I think it's important you understand this because all signs indicate that Armored Core 6 will have some successor to primal armor as well, since you can see it repelling attacks here in the trailer, and you can see a similar assault armor explosion here and here as well. Primal armor is a technology based on Kojima particles, which are extremely pollutive, to the point where primal armor is actually strictly banned in inhabited areas, as the mere after effect of a next fighting in this space could contaminate this area for generations to come. Now, a lot of our fights do take place near high-rise apartment buildings, but not to worry, they've almost always been long enveloped by the ocean or a desert wasteland, sapped of color and life, as, after all, very little of mankind actually remains on the Earth's poisonous surface. Instead, long ago, most of humankind fled to the Cradles, which are these massive airship colonies, each holding at least 20 million members of humankind, who escaped the pollution below so that they could live in the clean air above. But, according to the revolutionary group called Orca, maintaining the Cradles is actually causing horrible pollution on the surface, and it's Orca's belief that pollution will soon start bleeding into the atmosphere itself where the Cradles fly. So Orca seeks to commandeer the energy sources powering the cradles and use that energy for a different purpose. They wish to power an array of anti-satellite cannons and turn them towards the sky in an attempt to take out an interstellar web of assault cells that are blocking mankind's escape to space, because Orca thinks this world is doomed. But in your first playthrough, you're actually given no choice other than to side with the League establishment, who are attempting to prevent Orca from taking away the Cradle's energy source. The final fight has you defend those energy sources here in Arteria Cranium, where you fight against 2 enemy Nexts. So, on your second playthrough, you'll find new missions to play, and these lead to the Orca ending, where you actually end up on the opposite side, attempting to wrest the power sources of these cradles from the establishment. In this ending, the cradles are forced to land, subjecting mother and child to the pollution they had escaped in the skies. And even as humanity is decimated down here, they will discover a new frontier, outer space. But there's a third ending, one that's only open to you if you take on Orca members in their arena mode, until you meet and defeat an enemy pilot known only as Old King. He's a radical Orca member who takes a more direct approach to things, and so a new mission pops up on your board in this playthrough.
Greetings, lapdog. This is Old King. We're going to destroy Cradle 03. Care to join us? Orca has been too lenient for too long. In a revolution, blood must be spilled. Don't you think?
Good, you came. How obedient of you. Fell the cradles, all of them. Millions will die. Exciting, don't you think?
This mission is easy. The only challenge to you here is from your conscience, as Old King revels in the bloodshed.
1 down, 20 million dead. 40 million. 60 million. 80 million. 100 million. Done. There are still so many more lives to take. Our journey is just beginning.
But finally, your reckoning arrives. In the last mission, you're led into an ambush against a united force of foes who are disgusted with your actions. You and Old King have to face off against 4 enemy Nexts, and if you're doing this in hard mode, there's even a 5th. This is an extremely challenging fight, even for my build, which I thought was quite overpowered until this point. But somehow I take out 3 enemy Nexts, and then the 4th gets stuck beyond the wall, separated from myself and Old King, who has somehow survived. But rather than wait for my ally to get unstuck, I dive into combat on low health and just make it out alive. It was nerve-wracking, this fight, but I felt like I came out of it a better player, and I think one day I'd love to come back and attempt hard mode, where there's tons of unique twists to missions. Things are harder in interesting ways, like adding new mechs to the fights. So, For Answer easily ranks within my top 3 AC games, alongside Last Raven and Master of Arena, and I really would love to play it again. Now, if it wasn't obvious already from the footage, I emulated most of my For Answer playthrough. That's because my disc wouldn't play voice audio for some reason, and it kind of ruined my first playthrough. But I will say, being able to emulate this game without any FPS lag probably played a huge part in why I came to like this game so much, because performance on the PS3 version is not on the same level. So many of these missions are so epic in scale, like taking out these enormous arms forts, and these should be incredible experiences, but they really do put the old gen hardware to shame, unfortunately. So emulate these games if you can. That said, I've heard it's really hard to emulate the next couple of games on this list, and these are pretty much the last games that I want to talk about in depth here, because finally we've arrived at the 5th, and for the longest time it was the final generation. it's time to talk about Armored Core 5 and its sequel, Verdict Day. Whereas 4th Gen's music was toned for a beautiful melancholy, in 5th Gen, your garage sessions are instead accompanied by a thumping militaristic beat that glorifies war, a theme that is absolutely reinforced by the gameplay and story as well, because Armored Core 5 marks another huge generational shift, except this time it's in the direction of making Armored Core more of a mech war simulator rather than the mechanized power fantasy that it was in the 4th generation. And while this new style would absolutely grow on me, especially in 5's sequel, Verdict Day, I'm gonna be honest and say I really did not enjoy my time with Armored Core 5. To be fair, the game was largely designed as a multiplayer experience, but there is still a single player and I don't think it's very good. I found FPS performance to be lacking, I thought the visual clutter on the screen was atrocious, I didn't really feel like I could outplay my enemies, and the missions were long and lackluster with character dialogue that kind of made me cringe. The most fun I had in this game was because of my build, because for the first time really I chose a really heavy tank build, loaded with autocannons and heavy rifles. I figured if there was ever a time for a slow build, it was in this generation where I disliked the movement style, so might as well not move much at all and work that into my build. And I will say I love the new feature that allowed me to charge into enemies with my tank legs for massive damage. This is kind of like the move you can see the tank build do here in the Armored Core 6 trailer, so I had fun with my build even if I didn't like the game too much. But in the final mission of Armored Core 5, I saw a brief glimpse of how good the combat could be. In this fight you have time to preempt and dodge attacks, and learning the boss's moveset and attack patterns was quite rewarding and honestly something that I hadn't really experienced much of before in Armored Core. And luckily 5's sequel, Verdict Day, clearly learned a lot of lessons from 5. So instead of complaining about 5, I'd much rather talk about what I enjoyed in Verdict Day, and I'll probably explain the gameplay via my experiences with that game instead. Just like For Answer's soundtrack, Verdict Day's songs are absolutely iconic. Just listen to this beat. But it's not just the action tracks, the Karma Garage and menu tracks are so memorable to me now as well, so I'll let those play while I take you through the garage of the 5th generation. In 5th Gen, you basically begin with one part in every category, making it easy to try new weapons and equipment to try and figure out what build you like. The catch? All of these parts are junk. Like, literally, they're classified as junk parts, and they're weaker than everything else that you can get in the shop. But I think this is smart design because it means that at the start of the game you can't really go wrong with anything that you buy in the shop, because no matter what you do, it's probably going to be an upgrade from what you have. It's a clever way to onboard new players, in my opinion, and it gives you a really clear sense of progression, especially at the start of the game when that's very important. And I wonder if they'll do something like this in Armored Core 6. We do see a character scavenging parts from the battlefield at the start, after all. The first mission to give me trouble in Verdict Day actually shaped my entire build for the rest of my playthrough, because I couldn't kill these guys, and the only solution I found that would work was sniping them. And I was really happy to go with a sniper build, because that was another archetype I hadn't really figured out in previous games until now. I think it works well in this game specifically because it's very easy to get horizontal distance from your opponents in this game, and also the gameplay is just generally more tactical in Generation 5, with great rewards for careful positioning, which only got better given I could snipe enemies from really far away. So let me explain the combat. In this generation, your boosters can be toggled on or off, allowing you to either glide or walk. And if you're gliding on the ground, then you're able to activate Glide Boost, which is essentially an overboost that moves you around at an extreme speed at the expense of more energy. Then, finally, there's Quick Boost, which is kind of like the side boost from Armored Core 4, but worse. And then I guess you could also include jumping in this discussion, because jumping is also extremely important for movement in this generation, as jumping up buildings is your primary means of gaining height over your opponents, because you actually can't boost upwards in this game for very long, and also jumping perpendicular off buildings is also one of the fastest ways to move horizontally. And looking back, it's honestly kind of absurd that there are 4 separate buttons just for moving around the map in this game. Armored Core has always been a series that is really stressful on your controller inputs, but the 5th generation kind of takes it too far, in my opinion. Not to mention, another essential part of combat is scan mode, which you can toggle on or off with R3. In this mode, you can't fire your weapons, but your energy output skyrockets, allowing builds to quickly recover energy or just to be way more evasive for a long period of time. I would use this whenever I needed to get distance from my enemies, and then I would go back into combat mode for sniping. Of course, the other use for scan mode is, scanning, which is also very important. That's because there are 3 damage types in the 5th generation: kinetic, thermal, and chemical. And in retrospect, it's essential that you scan enemies, especially bosses, because it's essential that you choose weaponry that can overwhelm their unique defenses. Otherwise, you'll see the words ineffective whenever you hit them, and your weapons will just tickle them instead. Now, I was lazy, and I rarely felt like scanning, so there were a lot of enemies that I just tickled to death instead. Honestly, I don't like the scan system, because I love when Armored Core forces you to reconsider your broader strategy and to experiment with things, but I don't think there's much creativity involved when you're forced to just choose a weapon that enemies are weak to. It just felt like rock, paper, scissors the entire game, and I didn't really enjoy this damage system very much. What I did like in this game was the addition of Unax, which are these AI companions that you can choose to bring with you into missions. There's some really fun strategy involved in choosing a complementary ally for your build. For example, I chose a Unac that would tank and take aggro from me while I sniped in the distance, and this made the game way more enjoyable to play. In the previous game, I felt like I was just this bullet sponge that couldn't evade properly, but here the Unax actually enabled a lot of strategy, which is great. But even Unax can only do so much against the final boss, who was, perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, the most memorable part of Armored Core Verdict Day for me, because he was so difficult. I spent a lot of time trying to figure this guy out. He's essentially piloting a Next from Armored Core 4, and it is terrifying to go against. It makes you realize just how powerful those things were back then. Its strength lies mostly in its primal armor, which is almost impossible to break through in the first phase until it goes in for assault armor, which leaves it vulnerable for a short moment. I eventually figured out that if I dashed in and took a bit of damage here, I could end phase 1 in an instant, because I decided to use dual pile drivers, which were these short melee weapons that essentially ram a warhead deep into the body of your opponent for insane damage. It's very similar to what you see here in the AC6 trailer, actually. Then phase 2 begins, and you have to play out of your mind in order to succeed in this phase. You have to activate scan mode and overboost to evade those missiles, and then you have to deal damage whenever he stands still, and make sure you're at the perfect range as well, and also try to keep the sun behind you, because god, that sun is obnoxious. This fight is long, and you'll take a lot of unavoidable damage, so you have to really play perfectly in order to deal enough damage in time and take him out. Overall, I enjoyed Verdict Day just as much as any other Armored Core game, and I think with it they really perfected a lot of design decisions, and it goes to show just how much the sequels are sometimes the best of each generation in Armored Core, rather than just being more of the same. And I think if you don't play the sequels, you are really missing out. But I'm actually not done yet, because the last frontier was this: Formula Front Extreme Battle on the PSP. I never had a PSP when I was younger, so I was not going to pass up this opportunity to buy one. There are 4 Armored Core games on the PSP, but 3 of these, AC3, Silent Line, and Last Raven, these are remakes. The unique PSP title is this one, Formula Front Extreme Battle, where you're given every single part from the get-go, and you're simply tasked with climbing the ranks in the arena. The catch with this game is that you can technically beat this game without actually playing it, as there's a whole system of AI coding where you calibrate your AC to fight for you. It sounds good in theory, but these AI menus take forever to navigate, and often your AC won't listen to your preset commands, and they'll just happily shoot missiles into a wall instead while you're forced to watch. So I played through half the game manually, and I will say the enemy ACs in this game are really, really well designed. Their builds are very unique, and I ended up being forced to make 4 drastically different builds in order to progress and counter them. It was really fun, but one funny thing about this game is the whole aesthetic that it has. While every other game is this dystopian commentary on the terror of war and the dispassion of business, the music and the intros in Formula Front make you feel like you've entered a race in Gran Turismo, with an audience of adoring fans watching in anticipation as the announcer shouts "Go!" with glee. It's weird. If this is what peacetime looks like in the Armored Core universe, then I'll take the dystopian corporate nightmare, please. So in conclusion, I like Armored Core, and some of these games I even loved. Again, my top 3 in the end were Master of Arena, Last Raven, and For Answer. And I'm very thankful that I have all of you guys and this channel, as that's what motivated me to push through and understand this franchise. Because of that, I discovered a genre of games that I otherwise might have never discovered, and I think it's a shame that so many other people haven't tried these games. So I hope this video might help to convince a few people to give them a try and to push through any hardships that they'll face, so that you can get some mechanized memories of your own, so to speak. So again, if you want to play anything from this series, either see if you can get a fair price for them secondhand or just emulate. And if you do emulate, be prepared for some technical fiddling with settings for some of these games, but it should all be pretty possible with guides online. DuckStation is best for the PS1 games, PC SX2 is the best for PS2, and RPC S3 is best for PlayStation 3. And if you are interested, well, which game should you play? That is actually not a very easy question to answer. I think if you only have time to play one Armored Core game, then I would recommend starting in the 4th generation with Armored Core For Answer. It's probably the easiest single game to get to grips with, and it has fantastic depth if you do decide to do multiple playthroughs. But if you have time to play a couple of games, then I'd recommend that you play Armored Core 3 and Silent Line. These felt quite accessible to me. But if you really want dual analog controls and a challenge, then I'd recommend both discs of Armored Core Nexus and then Last Raven instead. But of course, this is just all my speculation. Play any from this video that sound interesting to you. You really can't go too wrong if you're dedicated enough. Okay, maybe don't play Ninebreaker or Formula Front, but that's about it. But thank you for listening to this extremely long video. I hope it gets you hyped for Armored Core 6. Playing all these games definitely has got me excited. But anyway, I'll see you next time.